these are very important lectures for us. I'm not going to have a long introduction because, of course, it's the third of three, and I imagine most of you will have been following what Rogers Brubaker, professor of sociology at UCLA, has had to say. But we have had some exceptional responses to his first two lectures. I have received emails from Berlin and from London congratulating us on persuading Rogers here to come to deliver his lecture in Vienna. And I am hugely looking forward to part three. After which I will exploit my position as chair and ask him a couple of questions, and then after that I'll be throwing it open to the floor. And so without further ado, I would ask Rogers to take the stand and deliver his lecture.
Good evening. I argued in my previous lecture that the embedding of the novel category, gender identity, in medicine, law, data gathering, and education amounted to a quiet revolution. An entirely new principle of classification, a new principle of vision and division of the social world, in Bourdieu's phrase, was established in core institutional domains. Classification by gender identity was increasingly competing with, displacing, or redefining classification by sex. No small matter, since sex, as I noted last time, is in historical and cross-cultural perspective arguably the most universal and fundamental principle of social classification. This development provoked little opposition and attracted little attention until relatively recently. But in the last 10, and especially in the last 5 years, gender identity has become a major focus of public controversy in the UK and the US, and a significant, or at least incipient, focus of controversy in many other countries. What changed? Why did behind-the-scenes institutional embedding yield to clamorous public contention? This is the main question that I address in this final lecture. It's tempting to characterize and delegitimize the controversy as a moral panic, instigated and cultivated by the right. Now, there's obviously considerable truth to this characterization, especially in the American context. Elements of a moral panic are unmistakable in the US, and the blatant instrumentalization of the issue by the American right has been evident for nearly a decade. In the last few years, the issue has also been instrumentalized by many European far-right parties as well. And the AfD and the FPÖ are among them. The issue has become increasingly salient in their discourse. Yet the controversy over gender identity cannot be reduced to a moral panic or understood solely through a left-right lens. This is abundantly clear in socially and culturally liberal Sweden and Finland, where the shift toward a much more cautious and restrictive policy on youth gender medicine began. It's also clear in the UK, where so-called gender-critical feminists, many of them left-leaning, have been central protagonists in the controversy. But even in the American context, which has been much more starkly polarized along left-right partisan lines, the moral panic perspective misses much of the story. It's too simple, I will argue, to treat all critiques of gender identity as reactionary attempts to turn back the clock on developments that unambiguously represent moral progress and enlightenment. So I want to tell a more complex story in this lecture. My argument is that as gender identity became an expansively actionable category, it ceased to be understood as a self-regarding matter. Once gender identity could be invoked even by children and adolescents, to demand social and legal recognition and gender-affirming medical interventions, and to gain access to single-sex spaces and activities, the category came to be understood as affecting others' interests as well. Women's sex-based interest in privacy, competitive athletes' interest in fairness, and parents' interest in protecting their children from potentially irreversible harm. This shift in what people could do with the category made gender identity ripe for political exploitation by the right. But it also prompted critiques from the center and center-left. My argument proceeds in 3 steps. I begin by sketching contention over single-sex spaces and activities, over gender-inclusive language, school curricula and policies, and self-ID laws that allow change of legal sex through simple declaration. I next characterize in a bit more detail the controversy over youth gender medicine, since this has been the most prominent focus of controversy on both sides of the Atlantic. I turn finally to the critiques of gender identity developed by gender-critical feminists, by some gay men and lesbians, and by some transgender people themselves. I'll conclude then with 2 broader observations, the first concerning the tension between strong and weak understandings of gender identity, the second, the ambivalence of the formalization and legalization of the category. So let me begin with the most striking indicator of left-right polarization in the American context, namely with the large wave of proposed and enacted state-level legislation. This began in 2015, built up after 2020, and gained further strength in the first months of the new Trump administration. It has led to the passage of hundreds of anti-LGBTQ and especially anti-trans bills in Republican states, with many hundreds more in the pipeline. The bills define sex as biological, binary, and sometimes explicitly as immutable. They restrict or ban gender-affirming healthcare for minors. They bar transgender people from using bathrooms and locker rooms and competing on single-sex sports teams on the basis of gender identity. And they prohibit teaching about gender identity and sexual orientation at certain grade levels. President Trump then raised the ante further, shifting the scene of action from the state to the federal level and launching a fierce rhetorical assault on transgender people. His initial blast of executive orders harshly repudiated the concept of gender identity. They described gender-affirming medical care as, quote, chemical and surgical mutilation. They characterized all participation in sex-segregated sports on the basis of gender identity, regardless of the level of competitiveness, as, quote, demeaning, unfair, and dangerous to women and girls. And they declared transgender people unfit for military service, since, quote, expressing a false gender identity divergent from an individual's sex conflicts with a soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle. The gratuitous cruelty of the language in these executive orders has been backed up with concrete steps to force compliance: investigations, subpoenas, threats of civil and criminal prosecutions, and threats to cut off funding. Now, these developments can be placed in the context of a broader and longer-running transnational conservative network of campaigns against so-called gender ideology, a term that has its roots in the response of the Catholic Church to the institutional codification of reproductive and sexual rights in the 1990s. Until the last few years, however, campaigns against gender ideology had not focused on gender identity or transgender issues. They had addressed instead issues like same-sex marriage, abortion, reproductive technologies, divorce, declining fertility, family structure, education about sexuality, and so-called gender mainstreaming, that is, the process of bringing a gender equality perspective to bear in every aspect of policymaking. Now, I've been concerned in each of my lectures to distinguish the specific category, gender identity, from the much broader and more ambiguous category, gender. Just as the institutional embedding of gender identity that I discussed in my previous lecture is conceptually and empirically distinct from the earlier institutional embedding of gender in the form of policies designed to promote equality between the sexes, so too the controversies over gender identity that I am concerned with in this lecture are conceptually and empirically distinct from the broader and longer-running controversies over gender or gender ideology. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that they're unrelated. The network of social and religious conservatives that has been campaigning against gender ideology for a couple decades has recently folded gender identity into its portfolio of concerns and given it an increasingly central place in recent years. And European far-right parties have done the same. But this shift to a central concern with gender identity and trans issues marks a new phase and a new configuration of so-called anti-gender politics. One key difference is that feminists were the central target of the earlier phase of anti-gender politics, whereas some feminists, the so-called gender-critical feminists, are key protagonists of this phase. To anticipate a point I'll come back to later, while gender-critical feminists have been sharply critical of the institutional embedding of gender identity, they've been strongly supportive of the institutional embedding of gender, specifically of policies designed to promote equality between the sexes. A similar point can be made about gay and lesbian organizations. While they were among the targets of the earlier phase of anti-gender politics, at least one important gay and lesbian organization has been a key protagonist in the critique of gender identity. So here, as elsewhere, politics makes strange bedfellows. But this is getting ahead of my story. The point I want to emphasize here is that the persistence over 2 decades of the label gender ideology masks an important reconfiguration in the substantive targets of anti-gender politics and in the actors involved. For this reason, situating current controversies over gender identity in the context of a broader conservative critique of gender ideology does not explain why these specific controversies emerged only around the middle of the last decade, after a period of quiet institutional embedding. The controversies that flared up over single-sex spaces, sports, gender-inclusive language, elementary education, self-identification, and youth gender medicine were responding to something new and specific, not just to a long-running unsettling of the traditional gender order. My argument is that gender identity had previously been understood as something that concerned only a small minority, and them alone. It had been understood as a self-regarding matter. But during the last decade, it ceased to be understood as self-regarding. Increasingly, it seemed to concern others. And this shift in public understanding responded to substantial changes in what could be done with the category gender identity. Now, one important kind of new work done by the category was regulating access to single-sex spaces, especially bathrooms, locker rooms, and prisons, and single-sex activities, especially competitive sports. In the US, a few controversies about bathrooms had flared up in the early 2010s in response to local anti-discrimination ordinances. These ordinances did not even mention bathrooms, and they did not center on gender identities. They banned discrimination in employment, contracting, and public accommodations on the basis of a whole series of characteristics, including gender identity. But conservative religious opponents of these measures argued that they might make it easier for men and sexual predators in particular to enter women's bathrooms. But the decisive step in making gender identity a national and not just a local issue was taken in 2016, toward the end of the Obama administration. This was the so-called Dear Colleague letter of the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which I mentioned in my previous lecture. The letter required all schools nationwide to allow access to bathrooms and locker rooms on the basis of gender identity. The policy was in effect only briefly, but it served notice that questions of access to single-sex spaces were no longer to be worked out on a case-by-case basis according to local circumstances. They were now codified as a matter of binding countrywide regulation. This bureaucratic codification was entirely new, and it, of course, implicated others, not just the small minority for whose benefit the change was made. The controversy over sex categorization in competitive sports has a longer history. The International Olympics Committee and other bodies have long had to determine the eligibility of persons with disorders or differences of sex development and, more recently, the eligibility of transgender athletes. But widespread public concern flared up here too in response to new laws and policies, such as a 2013 California law that required schools to allow students to play on teams consistent with their gender identity. The number of transgender women competing in elite women's sports is extremely small. But the controversy was responding to something genuinely new. Like the use of single-sex bathrooms and locker rooms, participation in competitive sports in accordance with gender identity implicated others, and it was easily understood as violating widely shared understandings of fair competition. Controversy over pronouns emerged in response to new norms, expectations, and policies that request or require the use of people's preferred pronouns. Such rules self-evidently affect others. Unlike a change in dress or grooming, a change in pronouns can't be accomplished on one's own. It makes demands on others. The same holds for other policies promoting gender-inclusive language, such as those that are currently the object of heated controversy in Germany and Austria and in a number of other European countries. Controversy over schools centered on new classroom materials and new policies regarding social transitions in schools. Parents could easily understand lessons on gender identity for young children as seeking to promote specific progressive understandings of sex and gender identity. In Evanston, Illinois, my hometown, pre-kindergarten children were taught that, quote, when someone is not a boy or a girl, maybe they feel both, they are non-binary or queer. A first grade lesson introduced preferred pronouns, including neo-pronouns like sie, zir, and tree. Students were then prompted to choose pronouns for themselves, and they were reminded that, quote, it is important to tell somebody to call you what you want to be called. A third grade lesson explained that, quote, it is a myth that gender is binary. Only you can know your gender and how you feel inside. Some schools also adopted policies aimed at affirming students' gender identity by aiding social transitions at school and concealing this from the parents when students felt that their parents would not be supportive of the transition. So it's not surprising that schools became a focal point of controversy. On social media, concerns about curricular indoctrination and about schools aiding gender transitions without parents' knowledge were greatly exaggerated. But here, too, the concerns were responding to something new. In the decentralized and fragmented American polity, controversy over gender identity has been dispersed across issue domains, like the ones I've just sketched, and also dispersed across particular sites of struggle. In Europe, the controversy has been much more centralized. A key focal point in addition to youth gender medicine, which I'll come back to in a moment, has been legislation allowing gender self-identification, often simply called self-ID. I noted in my previous lecture that procedures for changing one's official sex classification have been substantially liberalized. About 20 countries have adopted a self-identification model that gives full authority over sex reclassification to the individual, makes subjective gender identity the decisive criterion, and allows reclassification through simple declaration. The first countries to adopt self-ID did so without significant controversy. But since 2018, self-ID has emerged as a major flashpoint of controversy in the UK and as a significant focus of contention in Spain, Germany, and Sweden. Women's groups have figured centrally in this controversy. They have argued that full self-ID would open up access to women's spaces, bathrooms, locker rooms, and women's sections of hospitals and prisons, to anyone making a simple administrative declaration. Doing so, they have suggested, would disregard women's sex-based interest in privacy in intimate spaces, specifically an interest in not having to share such spaces with male-bodied people. But the controversy over self-ID turned less on its practical consequences than on its symbolic meaning. Opponents construed it not as a procedural change, a humane way of simplifying and expediting an existing legal procedure for changing one's legal sex, but rather as a fundamental cultural change. Self-ID construes sex as a matter of self-determination. By depathologizing and demedicalizing the change of legal sex and allowing anyone to change their sex to match their inner sense of gender identity without any gatekeeping, self-ID seems to its critics to subjectifies sex, to grant subjective feeling authority over what was previously understood as an objective fact. Many feminist critics see sex as an important legal and political category. They define women as a systematically disadvantaged sex class or sex caste. To them, self-ID is a dangerous step towards the erasure of sex as a legal category. And self-ID dramatically alters the cultural meaning of sex by granting the inner truth of identity more weight than the outer truth of the body. It's no small wonder, then, that self-ID has become a focus of controversy. The most powerful spur to public controversy in Europe, as well as the US, has come from changes in the practice of youth gender medicine. These include a surge in referrals to youth gender clinics and a striking shift in the composition of those referred. Earlier, most were natal boys with histories of childhood gender dysphoria, whereas recently, most have been natal girls with adolescent onset gender dysphoria. And nearly half of the adolescents referred in recent years have suffered from significant mental health issues. The most important change was the striking shift towards unconditionally affirming adolescents' declared gender identity. The previous insistence on the need for careful psychological assessment came to be seen as an illegitimate form of gatekeeping. And the originally strict criteria for providing puberty blockers or gender-affirming hormones or surgery were greatly relaxed. This meant that an adolescent's assertion of a gender identity at variance with their natal sex was now much more likely than before to lead to medicalization. The novelty of the treatments and the lack of reliable data about them raised questions about safety, about lifelong medicalization, and about bodily integrity, while the soaring numbers of young people identifying as trans or non-binary raised questions about social influences on gender identity. These questions, touching parents' deep concerns and fears about their children, were eminently conducive to a moral panic. But the controversy about youth gender medicine cannot be reduced to a moral panic or to a right-wing assault on trans rights. Several socially liberal European countries have adopted a much more cautious and restrictive stance in recent years after independent reviews revealed weak evidence for the safety and efficacy of medical interventions. Independent reviews in Europe also found no credible evidence that gender dysphoric young people are uniquely prone to suicide, or that gender-affirming treatments decrease suicidality. This was important because of the way the threat of suicide has been used to frame gender-affirming treatment as a matter of literal life and death, as, for example, when parents' hesitations about medical treatment have been met with the question, would you rather have a living son or a dead daughter? Even in the US, the moral panic framing captures only part of the controversy over youth gender medicine. The fact that the issue has been instrumentalized by the right should not blind us to the emergence of critiques of youth gender medicine from the liberal center and center left during the same period. Youth gender medicine assumes that gender identity is deep, enduring, and reliably knowable by adolescents and even by young children. Critics challenge this assumption. Data on so-called desistance indicate that most children diagnosed with gender dysphoria will outgrow their dysphoria without social transition or medical intervention. More generally, the assumption of a deep and immutable gender identity is in tension with a growing recognition of the dynamic and changing nature of the ways in which young people understand their sexed and gendered selves. Critics, therefore, endorse so-called watchful waiting or exploratory therapy rather than immediate affirmation. The therapy-first approach has been criticized as a form of conversion therapy by some youth gender medicine advocates. But proponents of exploratory therapy say it does not aim to change or challenge children's or adolescents' sense of who they are. It aims, rather, to open up a space for self-reflection and self-exploration. Since identity remains in flux during adolescence, they say, clinicians should be very cautious about recommending irreversible interventions. Critics see the increased prevalence of natal girls presenting with adolescent onset gender dysphoria as a further reason for a cautious therapy-first approach. Adolescent onset dysphoria is also a reason for suspecting that peer influence, social media, and culturally available narratives shape how adolescents interpret distress related to their changing bodies, emergent sexualities, and gendered expectations. Now, youth gender medicine advocates are very suspicious of this argument, but dismissing social influences on young people's understandings of who they are seems willfully unsociological. Emboldened by recent shifts in the discursive and political landscape, some critics of the affirmative care model oppose any medical treatment of gender dysphoria for minors. But other critics acknowledge that transition may be appropriate in some cases and may help relieve longstanding suffering. But they believe that declarations of gender identity taken on their own are far too flimsy a basis for highly consequential decisions about social transition, puberty blockers, hormones, or surgery. They therefore plead for caution and careful assessment, as well as for addressing any underlying mental health issues before any decisions are made about potentially irreversible interventions. Against activists who challenge medical gatekeeping in the name of autonomy, critics defend medical gatekeeping. They argue that children and adolescents, especially those suffering from significant mental health issues, may not be able to fully appreciate the ramifications of decisions with potentially lifelong consequences concerning, for example, fertility, sexual function, or the need for long-term medical treatment. In the the American context, it has become nearly impossible to think of gender identity as anything but a starkly polarized left-right issue. Both conservatives and progressives have been heavily invested in this view. Conservatives have seen themselves as restoring common sense in response to left-wing lunacy. Progressives have seen themselves as defending moral progress and enlightenment against the forces of reaction, ignorance, and hate. Conservatives and progressives have needed one another. Both have legitimized their own stance in relation to the threat represented by the other. The left-right lens obviously captures a real and hugely consequential polarization, but it misses important aspects of the story. This is most clearly evident in Europe. As I noted earlier, the shift to a more restrictive policy on youth gender medicine emerged first in a nonpartisan manner in socially and culturally liberal Northern Europe, and the controversy over self-ID has revealed important fissures on the left, with some women's groups skeptical about self-ID. But even in the US, where polarization has been starkest, the contours of contention cut across conventional left-right divisions. There's nothing specifically conservative, I would argue, about the concern with privacy in intimate single-sex spaces or with fairness in competitive sports, nor is it specifically conservative to have doubts about the wisdom of elementary school instruction on gender identity, or about school support for social transition without informing parents, or about the formal regulation of pronoun use, even if these issues have been taken up most vocally by the right, often in an ugly and polarizing way. But beyond these domain-specific controversies, three more general critiques of gender identity have emerged in recent years, none of which can be plotted on a left-right axis. One of these has been developed by gender-critical feminists, a second by some gay men and lesbians, and a third by some transgender people themselves. And I want to say a few words about each of these. The gender-critical feminist critique is by far the most developed of the three. It has been articulated in a substantial literature, both academic and non-academic. It emerged in the UK in relation to distinctive features of the British legal context, but similar arguments have been developed more recently in a number of other countries. The core argument of gender-critical feminists is that sex matters. They therefore object to what they see as the displacement of sex by gender identity, or the redefinition of sex in terms of gender identity. Sex matters on this argument in many medical contexts, not only those that directly concern reproductive biology. It matters in competitive sports, given substantial testosterone-mediated differences in performance. It matters in employment, given females' capacity for pregnancy and breastfeeding and how that affects their work trajectories. And it matters in sex-segregated spaces like bathrooms, locker rooms, and prisons. Since females face sex-specific threats of sexual violence, exhibitionism, and voyeurism from males, they have a sex-based interest in safety and privacy, according to this argument. More generally, according to gender-critical feminists, females face discrimination and disadvantage because of their sex, not because of their gender identity. To measure this disadvantage and to address it effectively, it's important to gather data on sex, not on gender identity. Gender-critical feminists also challenge the way gender identity has been understood. They challenge the idea that gender identity is universal and foundational for selfhood. Not all people, they argue, have a gender identity, as that term is usually understood. The fact that some people are unhappy in one way or another with their sex, and maybe even identify in certain respects with the other sex, does not necessarily mean, on their account, that they have a gender identity that is not congruent with their sex. Gender-critical feminists argue further that the discourse of gender identity draws heavily on stereotypes, about the nature and characteristics of boys and girls, and men and women, these stereotypical associations, they argue, may lead people to interpret sex-atypical dispositions or sex-atypical preferences in toys, activities, or clothing as signs of a gender identity at variance with their natal sex. Why should these not be interpreted instead, they ask, simply as signs of gender nonconformity that stretches the boundaries of sex categories rather than channeling gender nonconforming people into categories of their own? Some gender-critical feminists believe that males may become women in a socially relevant sense through a social or medical process of transition. But transition, they argue, is distinct from a mere feeling or declaration. Gender-critical feminists, therefore, reject the idea that felt or declared gender identity on its own is what makes someone a man or a woman. Gender-critical feminists, of course, do not speak for all or even for most feminists. Internal tensions have divided feminism from the beginning, but it is indisputable that gender-critical feminism has crystallized in recent years as a significant strand of feminist discourse. I turn now to the critique that some gay men and lesbians have articulated. Now, there's no recognized body of gender-critical gay and lesbian writing analogous to gender-critical feminism. And the gender-critical stance is certainly a minority view among gay men and lesbians, and one that tends to be held mainly by an older generation. But several elements of a critique have been coalescing in recent years. Like the feminist critique, this critique insists on the importance of sex. But its concern with sex is focused on the connection between sex and sexuality. Homosexuality, on this account, is defined by sex. It's a matter of same-sex attraction, not same-gender attraction. The intelligibility of homosexuality as a practice on this argument depends on people identifying themselves and their potential partners by sex. Some gay and lesbian writers challenge the assumption that all forms of sexual and gender diversity belong together and form the basis for a shared politics, as suggested by the LGBTQ acronym and its more elaborate offshoots. They argue that sexual orientation and gender identity are not always complementary modes of diversity that coexist happily under the rainbow flag. They may instead be competing ways of interpreting difference and defining social reality. More specifically, these writers argue that the focus on gender identity may lead some people with same-sex desires to redefine themselves as trans. Their main concern is with children and adolescents. The concern is that demoting sex to sex assigned at birth and inviting young people to consider the possibility that their gender identity, their true inner self, may not match their sex assigned at birth, may lead some gender atypical children who would have grown up to be gay adults, as gender nonconforming children often do, to instead interpret their gender atypical behavior or preferences as a sign of a gender identity that is not aligned with their sex, placing them, in some cases, on a path towards social and medical transition. Many older gay observers have noted that had they grown up in today's environment, they might well have been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, taken puberty blockers, and gone on to transition. Central to this critique is the concern that homophobia in young people themselves or in their families and social milieus may encourage adolescents who are troubled by their same-sex attractions to consider the possibility that their gender identity might differ from their natal sex. Seizing on this possibility, which of course has become much more culturally available and socially legitimate in the last decade or so, would allow them to reinterpret their same-sex desires as heterosexual. Yet, as Andrew Sullivan has argued, this interpretive reframing is akin to, quote, the deepest, oldest homophobic trope that gay boys aren't really boys. The fact that homophobia plays a part in such reinterpretations is no mere theoretical possibility, since most adolescents referred to gender identity clinics do report same-sex desires. Now, perhaps more surprisingly, the institutionalization of gender identity has also been criticized by some transgender people. Just as some feminists deny that gender identity alone makes one a woman, some transgender critics deny that gender identity alone makes one trans. They suggest that defining transgender solely or primarily in terms of how one identifies, without any reference to dysphoria or to transition, stretches the category to the point of meaningless and threatens the broad public recognition and rights gained in recent decades. On this view, that recognition and those rights rest implicitly on an understanding that transgender is grounded not simply in a declared identity, but in gender dysphoria so severe that it impels some people, a small minority of people, to embark on risky and costly projects of transition. Like gender-critical feminists and gay and lesbian critics, some transgender critics also insist on the reality and importance of sex. They do so because they understand themselves and their transgender trajectories in relation to their sex. They take the biological reality of their sex seriously, precisely because they have had to struggle with it all their lives. The distinction between sex and gender may have been famously pronounced illusory by Judith Butler, for whom sex is, quote, as culturally constructed as gender and will be shown to have been gender all along. But that distinction and the material reality of sex remains indispensable to the self-understanding of many transgender people, especially those who consider themselves transsexuals. So let me sum up my discussion so far by asking what ties together the various controversies over gender identity in connection with bathrooms, sports, pronouns, school curricula, self-ID laws, and youth gender medicine, all of which emerged in the last 10 and especially the last 5 years. My argument is that until around the middle of the last decade, a gender identity at variance with one's natal sex had been understood, for the most part, as a private, self-regarding matter, affecting only a small number of people. Even as the visibility of transgender people increased dramatically after the turn of the century, this did not at first alter the basic understanding that how transgender people choose to live their lives and whatever changes they might make in dress or adornment or bodily contours or personal identity documents was a matter that concerned only themselves. But in the course of the last 15 years or so, gender identity became a newly actionable category that could be used to do a whole bunch of new things. It became a rights-conferring, legal, and administrative category. It became an entry ticket for single-sex locker rooms, bathrooms, prison facilities, and athletic competitions. It became a sufficient reason for changing one's legal sex. It became a claim for puberty blockers, hormones, or surgeries on demand, even for adolescents. It became a justification in some contexts for a school to support a student's social transition without the parent's knowledge or against their wishes. It became a claim to be referred to using one's chosen pronouns. It became a pedagogic category used to encourage children to consider the possibility that their assigned sex might not match up with how they feel on the inside. As people became aware of the new work done by the category, it ceased to be understood as self-regarding. Claims and practices based on gender identity were now seen as potentially encroaching on women's interest in privacy, security, and fairness. They were seen as compelling others to alter their language practices, as exposing others to potential contagion or indoctrination, and as threatening parents' interest in protecting their children from potentially irreversible harm. Conservatives and radical right parties have greatly exaggerated these threats, presenting extreme examples as representative in an effort to mobilize fears. But the fact that this has become a fertile terrain for the right should not lead us to simply dismiss people's concerns as a moral panic, nor should it blind us to the major changes in the work done by the category gender identity. These changes were widely seen not only as encroaching on others' interests, but also as unsettling a deeply taken for granted understanding of sex as a material reality and as a foundational system of social classification. The critique of gender identity, in other words, has responded to something new. And the critique has not only come from cultural and religious conservatives and from parties of the far right, it has also come from the center and even, in some cases, from the left. And it has been formulated, as I've just showed, by some feminists, by some gay men and lesbians, and by some transgender people themselves. I'd like to conclude with two broader observations. The first concerns the tension between strong and weak understandings of gender identity. The second concerns the ambivalence of the formalization and legalization of the category. When gender identity was first established as a category in the middle of the 20th century, it was understood in a strong sense. For transsexuals, gender identity denoted a deep and persistent disidentification with one's natal sex, and an equally deep and persistent identification with or as the other sex. This strong understanding of gender identity as foundational, immutable, and refractory to psychotherapy is what legitimized then novel medical procedures, understood as a means of relieving otherwise unalterable suffering. There was no suggestion then that everyone had a gender identity in this strong sense. Gender identity was understood at the time to be relevant only in rare cases, which were expressly understood in the medicalized framework of the time as pathological. The embedding of gender identity in law, in data gathering, and in education, however, presupposed the universal applicability of the category. It only makes sense if everyone has a gender identity. Now, clearly, not everyone has a gender identity in the strong sense. Many people identify cognitively as members of their natal sex category without identifying emotionally in a foundational way with that category or with any other sex or gender category. And the degree and manner of their identification with or disidentification from that category may change over time. As a result, various softer, weaker definitions of gender identity have been proposed. I'll quote one from the Canadian Department of Justice, which defines gender identity as, quote, each person's individual and internal experience of gender. It's a person's sense of being a woman, a man, both, neither, or anywhere along the gender spectrum. This might be taken to mean that everyone's gender identity is unique. At the very least, it suggests a plethora of possible gender identities. Weak definitions, like this one, have an affinity with more general, soft, or postmodern understandings of identity as multiple, fluid, subject to change, negotiation, and experimentation. This way of thinking and talking about identity is influenced by, or at least compatible with, queer theory's critique of strong essentialist notions of identity, and it resonates with many young people. But it stands in sharp tension with the strong understandings of identity as inborn and immutable that continue to be invoked in legal and medical contexts. Ambiguity, to be sure, is not always a weakness. The sociologist Stephen Epstein has underscored the productivity of ambiguity, which may enable the, quote, successful uptake of concepts in diverse social contexts. The career of the category gender identity was no doubt facilitated by such productive ambiguity. The ambiguity entailed the category to escape the control of psychologists and psychiatrists, to move between professional worlds and lay publics, to accommodate different professional and political agendas, and to resonate and recombine with various strands of contemporary cultural discourse. Yet the ambiguity of the category has left it vulnerable to attack. The crux of the problem is that strong definitions are too strong to be universally applicable, while weak definitions are too weak to do the work that they've been asked to do. Strong definitions provide a strong warrant for anti-discrimination provisions, as well as for gender-affirming medical treatment. This is why legal scholars advocating for trans rights have often emphasized the immutability of gender identity, sometimes explicitly invoking an analogy to the immutability of race. Weak definitions, by contrast, provide no such warrant. Understanding gender identity as fluid, purely subjective, and potentially unique to each individual undermines the case for making it a legally protected category like sex or race. It also weakens the case for endowing the category with strong powers, especially the power to gain access to sex-segregated spaces or to claim treatment as a matter of medical necessity. I come now to my final observation. In order to do practical work in organizational contexts, categories require, or at least invite, explicit, formal definitions. The institutional embedding of gender identity formalized, legalized, and standardized informal self-understandings and self-identifications. Formalization made gender identity legible to and operationalizable by organizations. Legalization gave it binding force. Standardization made gender identity diagnosable and treatable, countable, and teachable. Together, formalization, legalization, and standardization made the category actionable in a broadening range of contexts. They made it a category that people and organizations could use to do a widening range of things. But the things that could now be done with the category inevitably affected others. The process of formalization, legalization, and standardization, therefore, also made gender identity a visible target and provoked a potent backlash. I have sketched in these lectures the initially uncontroversial emergence of the regime of institutionalized gender identity in medicine, law, data gathering, and education. And I've analyzed the belated but fierce eruption of public contestation over this regime, beginning in the middle of the last decade and intensifying in the last few years. In the US, in particular, gender identity has been drawn into the vortex of the culture wars and blatantly exploited by the right. The second Trump administration's assault on the dignity and humanity of transgender people has been shockingly cruel. Yet even in the hyperpolarized US, as I have argued, the controversy over the category gender identity cannot be plotted solely on a left-right axis. It cannot be reduced to a struggle between progressive defenders of the, quote, civil rights issue of our time, as President Biden put it, and reactionaries who think transgender people have, quote, no right to exist. It's a more complex struggle over how to think about sex and gender as principles of vision and division of the world. It's a struggle over the relation between nature and culture, between the sexed body and gendered feelings, and between what is given and what can be chosen. It's ultimately a struggle over the nature and limits of self-determination in an interdependent world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rogers, for all three lectures. I'm, as I said, going to abuse my position as chair to ask you a couple of questions to start with. Rogers is going to stay at the lectern for the questions. So I was struck in both lectures 2 and 3 by the phrase sex assigned at birth. As its introduction, as I inferred from you, seems to have been a pivotal moment in the controversy. And I've noticed in the past how often people use the passive voice, whether intentionally or unintentionally, as a means to obscure human agency. So what I'm interested in is who is doing the assigning here? Is it humans with a broader agenda, or there's that phrase assigned at birth has a slightly, to my ears, slightly sinister overtone. So can you give us an idea of how that phrase came about and what the implications of that phrase are?
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, I prefer not to sit. I find when I sit, I can't think. And so I'm an American who has, needs to wave his arms and move around and so on. So I appreciate your indulgence in my violating the conventions of the series. But I agree, that this is a pivotal shift from the language of sex to the language of sex assigned at birth. The language of assignment matters because it points to a social action, this action of assigning, not to a natural fact. It suggests that there's some act of assignment that actually constitutes something, right? It doesn't just record something, it constitutes something, in this case, sex. And it suggests, furthermore, that that this process, this act of assignment is a matter of social convention, that it's in some important sense arbitrary and that it might turn out to be wrong. And the reason that it might turn out to be wrong is not that someone might have an extremely rare disorder of sex development that leads to a medical correction later on. That can happen, but it's extremely rare. The reason it might turn out to be wrong, according to the proponents of the language of sex assigned at birth, is that the people who do the assigning, and indeed there are people doing the assigning, that is the medical professionals who read ultrasounds or who inspect genitals at birth and who specify the information that gets recorded on a birth certificate, they have access only to superficial and external signs of sex. They don't have access to gender identity. And it's gender identity on this view that ultimately holds the key to an individual's true sex. So on this view, true sex depends not on genitalia or chromosomes or gonads or secondary sex characteristic. It depends above all on gender identity. And that's why sex assigned at birth, the assignment, can turn out to be wrong. And there's another reason why I think this shift is indeed pivotal, and it's something I said in my first lecture, but I'll just make the point briefly here, is that it's easier to understand one's gender identity as not matching one's sex assigned at birth than it is to understand one's gender identity as not matching one's sex. And that's because the phrase sex assigned at birth suggests a kind of package, a social and cultural package, a set of norms, a set of expectations, a set of social conventions, in a way that the word sex on its own does not. So it suggests that one's assigned sex is not only it suggests that one's assigned sex is a matter of social convention, not some natural fact, and that what is assigned is not just your sex category, but your place in a social order, right, in the sexed and gendered social order. So people who don't recognize that place in the sexed and gendered social order, who find it alien, who don't find it doesn't resonate with their self-understanding, they can easily say, okay, my gender identity doesn't match up with that. So I do think that it's a pivotal phrase and a pivotal moment.
So you also said, and I'm quoting you now, my argument is that gender identity had previously been understood as something that concerned a small minority and them alone. It had been understood as a self-regarding matter, but during the last decade, it ceased to be understood as self-regarding. Increasingly, it seemed to concern others. And this shift in public understanding responded to substantial changes in what can be done with the category gender identity. So, in light of your argument there, is there here also an argument that previously minority groups had argued solely for the recognition of their own rights, whereas conservatives, people on the right, had more frequently argued for social conformity, i.e., anti-abortion movement, for example? Others must comply. But this is now a new phenomenon whereby a liberal minority was arguing that others should also conform to their idea of gender identity.
Yeah, let me just kind of step back and say that the politics of identity, always involves demands for recognition. So, the demand for recognition is not something new in this case. But I do think there is something new and distinctive about the ways that the demand for recognition are formulated in this case. And it's something we talked about a little bit in the Q&A after the first lecture. But gender identity is unlike other identities in that it's the only one that's conceived of as purely interior, right, or purely subjective, something that only the individual has access to. Think of other identities, ethnicity, race, nationality, religion, social class, sex, age, citizenship. All of them involve something more than self-identification. And I think this points to a very deep tension between what I would call a sociological way of thinking about gender identity and a more vernacular tradition of thinking about gender identity. The sociological way is that, sociologists think of identity as a social process. And that social process has two aspects. One is a matter of self-identification, self-definition. The other is an aspect of recognition by others, or identification by others, categorization by others, recognition by others. So there's this duality, and identity is created in that interplay between the internal and the external. Identity in the sociological understanding is never purely self-defined. It can't be. That's like a sociologically incoherent view. Identity is always negotiated with others. But there's an everyday way of thinking which is much more individualist. And it's this way of thinking that sees identity as privately owned, right, rather than publicly negotiated. It sees identity and authenticity as somehow deep inside the self and untouched by social influences. And in the domain of gender identity, I think the claims that have been made in the name of gender identity appeal to this second tradition, right, to this radically individualist way of thinking about gender identity. They locate gender identity deep inside the self. It's figured as a kind of property, right, as something that an individual simply has. And if that's what it is, if it's something that the individual simply has, then you can quite properly just say, this is what it is. You must recognize it for what it is. You must recognize me. This is who I am, right? So it's that you call it non-dialectical, non-dualistic understanding of identity as a kind of property that then leads to the demand that it be recognized rather than a kind of effort to negotiate it. But that kind of hyper-individualist demand for recognition is bound to produce friction and conflict once claims based on gender identity are no longer seen as self-regarding, but are seen as affecting others' interests and identities. When they were still seen as self-regarding, then fine. But when you demand recognition, that goes beyond the self-regarding. You're not just doing your own thing. You're wanting me to affirm your inner truth, and that creates friction.
Now, I'm going to finish up with my questions with a double-pronged one, which in the United Kingdom, much of this controversy was played out in the debates between J.K. Rowling and the two actors who appeared in Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson. in particular. And it hits upon two things. Why is it so intense in the Anglophone world relative to other parts of the world? And secondly, why are the arguments so intense between feminists and supporters of gender identity? Because that, certainly from a public perception in the UK, that's where it's been playing out, this debate. More so than in the United States, where it tends to be more conservatives, liberals.
Yes, I think that's right, that the configuration of the controversy is quite different in the US and the UK. And it's also correct that these are the two countries where controversy has been most intense. I don't think it's likely to remain that way for very long. I do think controversies are intensifying elsewhere as well. I guess what I'm worried about is that there's a powerful transatlantic demonstration effect that I am concerned about, that the radical right parties of Europe, who already have the issue very much in the moving towards the center of their discourse, will seize on the fact that the Republicans in the US and Trump in particular can pay no penalty whatsoever for the manner in which they have addressed these issues, and they will learn something from that. So I do think that controversies will intensify further. But okay, why US and UK? Why are controversies more intense here? I think there are different reasons in the US and the UK. I think the US really just has to do with the extreme partisan polarization. I know I've said that despite that partisan polarization, there's stuff that still doesn't fit the left-right story. I stand by that. But nonetheless, the fact of partisan polarization is such a decisive and powerful fact in the US. But the UK is very interesting because the story is very different. It's not a left-right story. As you say, it involves gender-critical feminists. Centrally, they are not right-wing arguments. Many of them see themselves as left-wing. So I guess one could push the question back and say, why does gender-critical feminism develop in the UK? Especially since it didn't actually originate there. I mean, it wasn't called gender-critical feminism at the time, but the early radical feminist ancestors, if you like, of gender-critical feminism were in the US in the 1970s. And then a whole generation later, gender-critical feminism crystallizes in the UK. So why in the UK? I think the answer is that there are a few key events that crystallize and focus attention. You mentioned J.K. Rowling. She was centrally involved in one of them. That was the case of a woman named Maya Forstater who lost her job after social media post in which she said that sex cannot be changed. The employment tribunal initially found that her views were not worthy of respect in a democratic society. That's a direct quote. This outraged numerous people, including J.K. Rowling. And so the controversy was already big, and then J.K. Rowling jumped in, and it just, everyone in the country had an opinion on this case. And eventually, on appeal, the tribunal found in her favor and said that her views were, in fact, constituted protected philosophical beliefs and that she had been unfairly dismissed. So that was a focusing event. There haven't been any such focusing events in the US. The other hugely focusing event was the public consultation for the reform of the Gender Recognition Act in the UK. That's a 2004 law. The government had thought it would propose a change to this law that would allow self-ID. But it involved, public consultations can be mere pro forma. This was not pro forma at all. Many, many people got involved in this consultation by sending in replies on the web and so on. But then there was also a huge amplifying effect given by a popular forum for parents called Mumsnet, so overwhelmingly for mothers. And this became a key site where the debate was played out. So it was kind of a vernacular form of gender-critical feminism that developed. So there are these focusing events which lead to in the context of specific aspects of the British legal system, which I can't go into here. Yeah, and then your final questions about why are the arguments so bitter between feminists and transgender activists. Of course, it's only a particular subset of feminists, those that call themselves gender-critical feminists. Feminists, of course, are arguing with one another, right? So the sharpest critics of gender-critical feminists are other feminists. But nonetheless, it's true that there has been very bitter arguments between gender-critical feminists and some transgender activists. And one reason for this is that some gender-critical feminists have been implacably hostile to transgender people and to everything that has to do with transgender as a social phenomenon. And they go out of their way to make this clear. Some. It's not, however, the majority of gender-critical feminists, and it's certainly not characteristic of the academic gender-critical feminists whose views I described in this lecture. They go out of their way to emphasize that transgender people should be protected from discrimination and violence. And many of them will even use preferred pronouns of people who have transitioned and so on. But there is that subset of gender-critical feminists who are really implacably opposed to everything transgender. But on the other hand, there's a kind of intransigent, there's an intransigent form of just some gender-critical feminists, but there's also an intransigent rejection on the part of some vocal trans activists of even the more nuanced feminist critique. And I don't think this kind of maximalist intransigent stance has served the transgender movement well, and I think you've recently seen many more transgender people speaking out against the maximalist stance.
Well, thank you very much. I never thought I'd hear Mumsnet referenced at an IWM lecture event, but you learn something new every day. Let me ask for questions from the floor, please.